What's up, you guys? My name is Shade and welcome to my guide on Final Fantasy XIV's system configuration menu, which just so happens to be my first video on this brand new channel. This video is excruciatingly thorough and was designed with new players and non-techie people in mind. So whether you've been playing the game for 10 years or 10 minutes, don't worry. You'll learn everything you need to know about every single setting in this menu. A little heads up though. I will be covering controller settings, but I've only ever played this game on a PC with a mouse and keyboard. This video was recorded using the PC version of the game, so any settings that are exclusive to the PS4 version are not covered in this video. Fortunately, there aren't too many of those and they don't seem too hard to figure out. If you are interested in a guide on how to set things up on a PS4 though, let me know in the comments. If enough people want it, I'd definitely consider making a separate guide for PS4 players in the future. By the way, in case you're new to my channel, you can find detailed timestamps in the video description, so if you want to jump ahead to a specific section, check that out. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is open the system configuration menu. If you're on a PC, hit Escape on your keyboard. It'll be right here in the middle. If you're on a PS4, hit the Options button on your controller. It'll be all the way over to the right. If you're playing on a PC, you should be in the Display Settings tab over here on the left. You won't see this tab if you're playing on a PS4. You'll be in the Sound Settings tab, which we'll get to in a few minutes. If that's the case, you can skip ahead to whatever time you're seeing on screen right now. So the first thing we can set is the main display. If you have multiple monitors, you'll see them listed over here on the right. Just pick whichever one you're going to be playing the game on. Next, we can set the screen mode. We can set it to windowed, borderless windowed, or full screen. If you want the game itself to take up your entire monitor, you're going to want to set this to either borderless windowed or full screen. Without getting too technical, the basic difference between the two is that the borderless windowed setting will let you switch back and forth between Final Fantasy and other windows you have open, but the game might run a little bit slower. Full screen mode is the opposite. Switching back and forth between windows is more annoying, but it might run a little faster. So, if you want the game to take up your entire monitor, I would test both out and just use whichever one you prefer. Windowed mode, on the other hand, runs the game in a window that you can drag, minimize, and maximize like any other window on a computer. In this mode, you also get access to the Windows taskbar while playing, but like with borderless windowed mode, you also get that performance penalty too. I'm constantly switching back and forth between windows, so this is what I always use. Next is the resolution setting. Resolution, for those of you who don't know, is the size of a computer monitor or TV measured in pixels. For example, a monitor with a resolution of 1920 by 1080 measures 1920 pixels going across and 1080 pixels going up and down. If you're not sure what your monitor's resolution is, here's how to quickly find out for Windows 10 users. Get over to your desktop, right-click on the background somewhere, and then choose Display Settings at the bottom here. Make sure that the monitor you're using to play Final Fantasy on is selected up here, and then scroll down to the Display Resolution setting. Your monitor's correct resolution is probably whatever is marked as recommended by Windows. If you're playing in borderless windowed or full screen mode, you're going to want to set the in-game resolution to match the resolution of your monitor. You should find it as an option in the drop-down menu over to the right, but if you can't for some reason, you can just type it in below. If you're playing in windowed mode, you can set this to whatever you want, or just hit maximize up in the top right every time you need to resize the window like I do. After that, we have high resolution UI settings. You can set this to 100%, 150%, or 200%. All this setting does is blow up the user interface or UI stuff on your screen. You can use this to quickly scale everything up all at once like this. Then we have default UI size. This does basically the exact same thing as the previous setting, only you get more options to choose from. Just pick something over here on the right, click Apply All, and then click Yes, and there you go, everything's resized. Next, we have full screen mode gamma correction. which is basically more or less just a fancy way of saying brightness. If everything else on your monitor looks totally fine, but for some reason Final Fantasy in particular looks darker or more washed out than it should, you can use this slider to correct it. The character lighting setting right below that is basically a brightness slider that only applies to characters. You, other characters, and non-playable characters or NPCs. And that brings us to the frame rate setting. Without getting too technical, frame rate is basically the number of times a computer monitor or TV can change per second. A game running at 60 FPS, for example, means that the game screen is changing 60 times in 1 second. There are 60 frames per second. At a high frame rate, movement looks nice and fluid. At a low frame rate, it looks choppy and jagged. You definitely want your games running at the highest possible frame rate, but not higher than what your monitor or TV can handle because that can cause screen tearing. Getting back to the settings we have here, we can choose none, refresh rate 1, refresh rate 1/2, or refresh rate 1/4. Setting this to none means that Final Fantasy will run at as high a frame rate as it possibly can with no limit. You can run into screen tearing if you use this setting. Setting this to refresh rate 1 means that Final Fantasy will run at as high a frame rate as it can, but it will be capped at the maximum frame rate that your monitor supports. So if your monitor's maximum frame rate is 60 frames per second, Final Fantasy will never go over 60 frames per second, no screen tearing. You can also set it to refresh rate 1/2 or refresh rate 1/4, which limits your frame rate to 1/2 or 1/4 of your monitor's maximum refresh rate, but don't do that. Unless, for whatever reason, you want to force Final Fantasy to cap at either of those frame rates. And then we have two toggles. Limit frame rate when client is inactive means that the frame rate will drop way down if you click off of Final Fantasy, like if you're watching Netflix on your other monitor or something. This will let your graphics card take a little rest while you're busy with other windows. Personally though, I switch back and forth between windows a lot, and I don't want my graphics card to have to start and stop so often. That seems like a bad thing in the long term. And finally, we have limit FPS when away from keyboard. I turn this on because it only activates when I haven't done anything in Final Fantasy for like 10 minutes or so. If I go AFK and leave Final Fantasy running, which I do all the time, I want the frame rate to drop so my graphics card doesn't have to work so hard. Alright, and that's it for display settings. Next we have sound settings. If you're playing on a PC, the first thing you see is a big group of toggles to mess with. Play sounds when window is not active means that when you click off of Final Fantasy, if you minimize it or Alt-Tab or click another window, you can still hear the game. Below that, you can choose which sounds you want to still hear when you do this. Personally, I disabled everything except for system sounds, and I left that on for one very good reason. In Final Fantasy, when you're waiting to enter a dungeon or a raid or something, you basically have to wait in line, or a queue as the game calls it. Depending on the job you're trying to enter as, you could be waiting a while. DPS classes tend to have the longest wait times, averaging at about 10 to 20 minutes or so for duty roulettes. When your turn to enter the duty comes, you'll hear a very distinct sound. And if you leave the system sounds checked, you will hear the sound even if you have the game minimized or Alt-Tabbed. So instead of leaving Final Fantasy on screen the whole time, you can just Alt-Tab out of it or minimize the window and do something else while you wait. Just be sure to check back every 7 to 8 minutes or so to move your character a little bit. Being totally inactive for too long will make the game think you've gone AFK, and you could be kicked out of your place in the queue. And again, that's especially painful if you're trying to join as a DPS class. Anyway, feel free to check any of these that you want to continue hearing while you're doing other non-Final Fantasy stuff. Next, we have play music when mounted. All mounts have music that plays when you ride them. Don't like your favorite mount's music? Uncheck this box so that when you ride it, you'll continue to hear the music for the area that you're in instead. After that, we have enable normal battle music. Similar to mount music, anytime you fight something, some battle music will play. Different areas and dungeons have different battle music, but if you'd rather continue hearing the area's music instead while fighting, be sure to uncheck this box. Then we have enable city-state background music in residential areas. Most major cities in Final Fantasy XIV have residential areas that you can access. When you're in any of these residential areas, this song will play. If you get sick of this song, check this box and you'll get to listen to a nice town theme instead. Next we have play system sounds while waiting for duty finder. Remember that sound you hear when your turn to enter a duty finally comes? If you check this box, you'll hear a continuous ticking noise after that as well. I leave this checked just in case I somehow miss the initial sound. And that brings us to the listening position setting. Zoom the camera out as far back as you can and attack something. Do you want it to sound like you're listening from far away? If so, slide this over to the left. Want it to sound like you're right next to your character? Slide this to the right. And then in volume settings, we have a bunch of sliders to adjust the volume of individual types of sounds. Master volume affects all sound coming from the game. BGM stands for background music. Sound effects includes any non-vocal sound made by characters and enemies. Footsteps, jumping, attack sounds, things like that. Voice affects things spoken by characters, including battle voices, which you hear all the time, and cutscene dialogue. System sounds include sounds in the game that are not made by characters or enemies. Things like clicking a button, opening a menu, the game screaming at you for not being able to use a skill. This also includes the sounds that you hear when your duty finder queue is up. So do yourself a favor and keep this one nice and loud. Ambient sounds include sounds made by the environment. Birds chirping, rivers, oceans, rain. Turn this up and check this box for some free ASMR. In Final Fantasy XIV, bards, a DPS class, can play music, which you hear occasionally in crowded towns. The performance slider affects this music. Next, we have the player effects volume section, which allows you to adjust the sound effects made by you, members of your party, and other players not in your party. 24-man raids can get pretty noisy, so keep this section in mind if you'd rather hear more background music and less skill spam. And finally, that brings us to the Equalizer. You can adjust this to make the game sound more bassy, trebly, voicey, or Logitech-y. I've played around with these settings for a bit, and personally, I think standard sounds the best. And that's it for sound settings. Next we have graphic settings. So this is where things get really complicated. Or at least they would if I actually took the time to explain exactly what each of these settings does. Instead, I'm going to do my best to just show you what each setting does, and then give you only as much information as you really need to figure this stuff out. Okay, first we have Enable Wet Surface Effects. I definitely leave this turned on. It really adds a lot to the environment when it's raining, and it really doesn't seem to hurt performance much at all. Next, disable rendering of objects when not visible, aka Occlusion Culling. This one's kind of important to understand, so here's a quick, simple explanation. Basically, if you can't see an object, the game saves resources by just pretending it doesn't exist. The trade-off, however, is that objects will sometimes suddenly pop in like this. During my testing, I found that turning this on only really helped in really niche cases where some object is blocking a lot of things on screen. But honestly, that really doesn't happen too often in this game. After that, we've got Use Low Detail Models on Distant Objects, Level of Detail. Distant objects look really bland, and you get a ridiculous amount of pop-in if you turn this on. Turning this on does help performance a bit, but I also noticed something really weird about this setting, and based on a quick Google search, this seems to be a pretty widespread issue. If I turn this off, I sometimes get this horrible flickering effect when I look down at shadows cast by leaves in tall trees. It doesn't seem to happen as much with shorter trees though, and I think that's because if you're walking, the leaves in shorter trees are physically closer to you. Anyway, I'm going to try to keep this from getting way too complicated. If you turn this setting on, it helps performance a little bit. If you walk under a tall tree, here's what it can look like. Turning this on will also give you that horrible pop-in effect. If you turn this setting off, it hurts performance a little bit, and near tall trees you get that flickering effect. But you don't get the pop-in effect. Personally, I keep this setting off. That pop-in is way too distracting. Okay, after that we have real-time reflections. This only really affects objects that have light reflecting off of them, like a shiny floor under a ceiling lamp or light shimmering off of water. Turning this on will lower your frame rate a bit, and I honestly don't think I'd ever even really notice it if I turn this setting off entirely. So if you're looking for ways to increase your frame rate, this is one you can probably turn off in my opinion. And then we have edge smoothing, also known as anti-aliasing. Turning this on doesn't seem to hurt the game's performance too much. I would leave it on if you can. After that, transparent lighting quality. This one seems to hurt the most when you're looking at a large body of water. You can turn it off, but water looks so much better if you leave it on. Next is grass quality. This one doesn't seem to cost too much, and it gives a lot of character to grassy environments, which are extremely common in this game. I'd leave it on if possible. Then we have Parallax Occlusion. This one will cost you a bit of performance, but walls and floors can look pretty flat if you turn it off. Honestly though, as long as you don't zoom the camera in too much, you probably won't even notice it after a while. Up next is Tessellation. Turning this off makes moving water appear more flat. I'd leave it on, it looks better and doesn't seem to hurt performance much at all. Next, we have glare. This is the only instance I was able to find that this setting actually affected, and it was a very minor effect. But it also had a very minor performance cost, so I'd leave it on. And then we've got map resolution. All it does is make your map and minimap look a little clearer, and it barely seems to affect performance. I'd just leave this one on. After that, we have some toggles for turning shadows off for yourself, your party members, NPCs and alliance members, and enemies. Next is use low detail models on shadows, level of detail. Unfortunately, I can't show this one at all. I spent over an hour trying all kinds of things in different locations and different lighting conditions, but I could not figure out what the hell this setting actually does. I know what it's supposed to do, and theoretically turning this on should improve performance a bit, but at least right now it doesn't seem to do anything at all. I don't know, could be a bug, I'm not sure. And then we have shadow resolution. I get a really distracting flickering effect on tree shadows if I turn this down to normal or low. Next is shadow cascading. I'd turn this up as high as you can. It doesn't seem to hurt performance too much. And then we have shadow softening. This is an important one. I would definitely leave this set to strong, especially if you have to turn down the other shadow settings. This will make your shadows a little more blurry, which will actually help hide low quality shadows, and it doesn't hurt performance much either. Next we have texture filtering. I would leave this set to anisotropic if you can. It improves shadows a little bit, but it really adds a lot to floor textures while not costing too much in performance. After that we have anisotropic filtering. This one was really hard to figure out, and it only actually applies if you choose anisotropic filtering up above. It barely seems to change anything though, and I wasn't able to notice a performance difference at all. I leave it set to times 16 since, on paper, that's the highest quality option. After that, we have some toggles for adjusting the level of detail in physics for yourself, your party members, NPCs and alliance members, and enemies. Turning movement physics off makes your hair and gear appear really stiff even when moving. Also, breasts are a little sandbag-ish. Turning movement physics to simple seems to animate your hair. Gear's still pretty unresponsive though, and you're still hauling sand. Turning movement physics up to full makes your gear more bouncy. And also, yeah. And after all that bouncy nonsense, we can naturally darken the edges of the screen, aka limb darkening. I didn't notice a performance difference either way, so just go with whatever you prefer. Next, we can blur the graphics around an object in motion, aka Radial Blur. To be honest, this one's a little tough to compare visually, and even tougher to accurately gauge how much it affects performance. From my testing though, turning this on seemed to hurt performance a tiny bit, but much more importantly, when I turned this on, it actually felt like it was harder to keep track of what was going on in a fight. For that reason alone, personally, I would never turn this setting on, but that's just my preference. Then we have Screen Space Ambient Occlusion. This one adds a lot of detail to shading to provide a strong sense of depth. Turning this on can severely impact your performance though, so I suggest taking some time to experiment with this one. After that, we have the glare setting. This setting seems to mostly affect glowing objects. Leaving this on hurts performance a little bit, but this is one performance hit you should definitely take. This game's artists are hopelessly addicted to giant glowing crystals. If you find yourself having to run through an area like this, do it at night. Trust me. Next is water refraction. As far as I can tell, this only affects anything when you're underwater, and it really doesn't seem to affect performance much at all. And finally, we can enable depth of field in cutscenes. I really wanted to include a side-by-side comparison for this one, but after a little bit of testing, it seems that the intro cutscene to this game doesn't actually utilize depth of field at all. But depth of field is used by the idle camera. Here's what it looks like. Basically, enabling depth of field just makes far away objects appear blurry to create a stronger sense of depth. Enabling this option would add this effect to cutscenes. Alright, now that you've seen more or less what each of these settings does, here's the hard part. Figuring out what to set everything to so that you get the best possible gameplay experience. That is, coming up with a target frame rate like 60 FPS or 90 FPS, and then adjusting these settings so that the game looks as good as possible while actually reaching that frame rate most of the time. This topic alone really should be its own standalone video, so I'll just give you some very quick tips on this. First, head over to one of the starting cities in the game. I suggest Gridania because it's full of plants and isn't overcrowded like Limsa Lominsa typically is. At the top of the graphics settings tab, test each preset and run around a bit on each, keeping an eye on your frame rate. Find the setting that gives you the best overall game experience and then choose the setting one below that. So if standard desktop is the best option for your system, choose standard laptop instead. This is where you'll start tweaking individual settings. In my experience, it's easier to start low and slowly increase settings one by one, starting with the settings that matter the most to you. In my testing, the settings that affected my frame rate the most were Screen Space Ambient Occlusion, Parallax Occlusion, and Transparent Lighting Quality. Of course, your results may vary depending on your PC and where you are in-game when you do your testing. And with all of that said, good luck. Remember, if you have any questions, post them in the comments and I'll do my best to help you out. And after all of that, we've got mouse settings. First, we have allow resolution changes via mouse drag. I would leave this selected especially if you play in windowed mode and have multiple monitors. This allows you to resize the game window by clicking and dragging on the edge of the window. More importantly, turning this on allows you to very easily move the game from one screen to the other and set it up to take the whole screen. I use this all the time. Then we have limit mouse operation to game window. Turning this on makes it so that you cannot move your mouse out of the Final Fantasy window, meaning that to switch to another window, you would pretty much have to Alt-Tab to get out of the game window. If you switch back and forth between Final Fantasy and other windows all the time like I do, you'll definitely want to keep this turned off. Next, we can adjust the mouse camera sensitivity. You can move the camera by holding down the left mouse button and then moving your mouse around. This slider changes how much the camera moves in-game when you do this. The next group of settings changes how the in-game cursor looks. You can set this to Hardware Cursor Final Fantasy XIV Custom so that it has that distinct Final Fantasy look. You can set it to Hardware Cursor Operating System Standard so that the cursor looks just the same as it does on your computer desktop. Or you can set it to Software Cursor, which looks just like the Final Fantasy cursor. It could just be my imagination, but it feels like there's a little bit more of a delay with this setting. It doesn't feel quite as responsive as the Final Fantasy XIV custom setting to me, but this setting does allow you to change the mouse cursor's size. And you can do this. Kind of distracting, I think, but there you go. After that, we have Gamepad settings. Enable Gamepad does exactly that. If you turn this off, your controller won't do anything. After that, you can choose which device you want the game to use, in case you have more than one. If you plug in your controller but it doesn't do anything, make sure you've got the right one selected. My PS4 controller shows up as wireless controller here. Right below that, you can tell Final Fantasy what type of gamepad you're using so that it can display button prompts and stuff like that correctly. Shapes instead of letters or vice versa. You can keep the gamepad enabled when the client isn't active, meaning that if you click off of the Final Fantasy window, your controller will still work in-game. Then, you can enable vibration. According to some light Googling, you're supposed to feel vibrations when fishing, using limit break attacks, and also when your duty finder queue is up. I tested this out a couple of times, but vibrations didn't work for me. I have no idea why. Enable L1 plus L auto run means that while you're running with the left stick, if you tap L1, you'll start auto running straight ahead of you. You can still steer your character left or right while auto running, but you'll be restricted to tank controls. The tank controls feel really awkward to me, but there are some huge areas in this game. Auto running is incredibly helpful. You can cancel auto running by tapping L1 or by moving your character backwards. Then you can enable window zoom via R3. If you turn this on and then open a window, then when you press the right stick in, the window will start to resize like this. It might be good to keep this on if you want to set custom sizes for all of your different windows, like for example if you want your inventory window to be really big but you want your character stats window to be really small. Once you have all of them at the right size though, I would turn this off so you don't accidentally resize menus later on. After that, you can enable text pasting with L1 plus R1. If you copy some text and then open the chat window in-game, you can paste it in by pressing L1 and R1 at the same time. If you're on a PC with a mouse and keyboard, you can paste with Ctrl-V. Next, we have the analog stick sensitivity slider. Have you ever noticed how, on old controllers, analog sticks tend to get kind of flimsy and loose over time? And they might even start to move a little when you shake the controller? If you grew up playing Mario Party like I did, you've definitely experienced this. So, without getting into an overly technical discussion about phantom inputs and dead zones, if you sometimes notice your character or your camera ever moving on its own, you should try moving this slider over to the right. That should fix it. And that's all you really need to know about this setting. After that, you can enable a virtual mouse. You activate the virtual mouse by holding down L1 and pressing in the right stick. There you go, your controller is now a mouse. You move the cursor with the right stick, L2 is left click and R2 is right click. Hold down L1 and press the right stick again to disable the virtual mouse. After that, you can calibrate your controller. If you press down on your left stick but you start running at some weird, unexpected angle, or you press X but the game keeps on doing triangle, you probably need to recalibrate your controller. And finally, we have button configuration. It's a little limited, but this setting is where you can change what each individual button on your controller does. One very interesting thing to note here is that you can set L3 and R3 to execute one of two macros, which you can customize to do just about anything. Macros are way outside the scope of this video, and I'm not at all a macro expert. But one very useful thing you can do with these buttons is to use one button to set a focus target and use the other button to target your focus target. In this game, focus targets basically allow you to target a specific enemy or ally instantly by pressing a single button, and this is extremely helpful when playing as a tank or healer class. Here are the two macros you can use to do this. By the way, if you guys know of any other useful things you can do with macros for controller users, please let me know in the comments. And that's it for gamepad settings. Next, we've got the theme settings tab. This one's really simple. You can choose between a light theme and a dark theme for your menus. I choose dark because it doesn't strain your eyes quite as much. And then we've got other settings. First, we have screenshot format. You can save screenshots as either PNG files or JPEG files. PNGs typically are higher quality, but are also larger in file size. I would consider choosing JPEG if you take lots of screenshots and you're running out of space on your hard drive. Then you can choose your screenshot folder. This is where your screenshots will actually go when you take them. After that, we have Auto-AFK settings. If you stand around and do nothing for long enough, the game will set your status to AFK. How long is long enough? You can set that here. You can also turn this off too if you want. Next, we have display limits. First, we have limits for characters and objects. If you find that you can play the game just fine in normal areas like this, but the game lags a lot in more crowded areas where you've got a lot of characters running around, or in residential areas where you've got a lot of objects laying around, turning this setting down should help. And then we have a limit for open windows. By windows, the game means menus. You can set a limit here if you want, so the game starts closing menus for you once you reach the limit. This setting is for sociopaths. Join humanity and just press escape like everybody else. Don't be weird. After that, we have language settings. This setting affects cutscene audio and nothing else. If you want to change the language of written text, you can do that in the game launcher when you first start the game, just before you sign in. Right here. After that, we have some group pose, aka G pose, and idle camera settings. Switch to idling camera when Auto-AFK activates does exactly what it says. If you turn this on, then when you go Auto-AFK, you'll start seeing close-ups of enemies and NPCs in the area, along with random overhead shots of your surroundings. This is the idle camera I showed you before. I leave mine off because when I'm AFK in-game, I prefer the game to use as few resources as possible. Lastly, we have switch online status to camera mode while active. While you have group pose or your idle camera active, you can also have the game put a little camera icon next to your name, so people know you're busy doing cinematic things. And finally, that brings us to accessibility settings. First, you can enable visual alerts and then customize their size and transparency. And then we have some color filtering you can do if you have difficulty seeing certain colors. Here's what they all look like. Just choose whatever looks best to you. And then after that, we have nothing. That's the entire system configuration menu as of this recording. See? This video is excruciatingly thorough. I wasn't kidding. Real quick, I want to sincerely thank you guys for all of the support and feedback I've gotten from the Final Fantasy XIV subreddit, all of the emails and direct messages I've gotten, and I especially want to thank my Patreon supporters. Dewey and Josh, thank you guys so much. You guys are ridiculously cool for going out of your way to give back like that. I put a hell of a lot of work into this stuff, and people like you really help keep me going. Seriously, thanks guys. Anyway, in the near future, I'll be covering the character configuration menu, along with plenty of other Final Fantasy XIV and non-Final Fantasy XIV related content as well. And by the way, I actually have a second new YouTube channel specifically for Let's Plays, and one of the first series I'm doing is a full Let's Play of Final Fantasy XIV from start to finish on a brand new alt. There's a link in the video description if you want to check that out. As always, if you have any questions, suggestions, love, hate, or whatever else about any of this stuff, and it was a lot of stuff, leave a comment. I read them all. Or check the video description for another way to get a hold of me if you'd prefer. And if you thought this video didn't suck, please leave a like, consider subscribing, and hit the bell to see more just like it in the future. Most importantly though, if you know of any new players who might benefit from this video, tell them about this channel. I've got plenty more Final Fantasy XIV content coming real soon. Anyway, thanks for watching guys, hope it helped, see you in the next one.